All right, today we're digging into a chilling piece of American history. It's a true story about how the fear of a deadly disease convinced an entire community that a 19-year-old girl was a vampire, and the tragic results that followed. I know, it sounds like a strange question, right? But it's at the absolute heart of this story that unfolded in New England near the end of the 19th century. And it's a crazy case that shows just how far desperation can push people. So, let's set the scene. It's a cold March morning in the small town of Exeter. A group of men are gathering in a cemetery. But they're not there to mourn. They're there to do something pretty unthinkable. They're there to disturb the dead. You've got a local doctor, a guy named Harold Metcalf, and he's there with several townspeople. They've all shown up at the Brown family plot with a grim and honestly desperate purpose: to dig up the bodies of a mother and her two daughters who had recently died. So when they opened the graves, the bodies of the mother and the older daughter were, well, they were basically just skeletons. Exactly what you'd expect. But then they got to Mercy Brown. She'd only been buried for 9 weeks in the frozen ground, and her body was shockingly well preserved. For the terrified townspeople, this wasn't science. Oh no, this was proof of the undead. Okay, to really get why this happened, why a whole community would resort to digging up their dead, we have to talk about the terror that was just hanging over them, a disease they called consumption. Today, we know it as tuberculosis, or TB. But back then, you have to remember, they didn't understand germs. Consumption was this mysterious plague, a death sentence that seemed to just creep through families, picking them off one by one, and no one knew why. And get this number, 80%. That was the reality, an 80% mortality rate. That meant if you developed active consumption, you were almost certainly going to die. This wasn't just a sickness. It was a slow, inevitable countdown that fueled absolute panic. The symptoms themselves were just horrifying. The disease wasted the body away. You'd have this crushing fatigue, night sweats, a persistent hacking cough, sometimes with frothy blood. It literally looked like the life was being drained out of the victim day by day. You can kind of see how that would be the perfect breeding ground for vampiric folklore, right? So this widespread terror, it became intensely personal for one family in particular, the Browns, led by a local farmer named George Brown. And just look at this. The tragedy for George Brown was relentless. Between 1884 and 1892, he buried his wife and 2 of his daughters, all from consumption. So when his last son, Edwin, also got sick, the community saw this clear, sinister pattern. This didn't look like a disease anymore. It looked like a curse. Desperate for any kind of explanation, the neighbors started pressuring George. They brought up this old superstition, this idea that one of his dead relatives was not truly at rest, that they were, in essence, a vampire, draining the very life from his last surviving son, Edwin. Now, George Brown, he was skeptical. He didn't buy into the superstition. But you have to put yourself in his shoes. He's a desperate father, watching his only son die right before his eyes. So caught between the town's immense pressure and his own helplessness, he reluctantly gave them his permission. And this brings us right back to that day in the cemetery. The town believed they had their proof in Mercy Brown's preserved body, and now they felt they had to act to save Edwin. Dr. Metcalf, the physician who was there, he tried to offer a scientific reason. He explained that she was buried in the frozen ground of winter, which essentially kept her body in cold storage. But in the face of all their grief and all their fear, the town's superstition was just much, much stronger than his logic. So what they did next was this grim ritual, a supposed cure rooted deep in old European folklore. They cut out Mercy's heart and liver, burnt them to ash on a rock, and then mixed those ashes into a tonic for her sick brother. In their minds, by making Edwin consume the vampire's essence, they would break its supernatural connection and save his life. But the folk magic was a tragic failure. The cure did nothing. 2 months later, consumption claimed its final victim in the immediate Brown family. Edwin died. And that horrific ritual had all been for nothing. So, what can we take away from this harrowing story? Well, it's a powerful and deeply sad lesson about what happens when overwhelming fear meets scientific ignorance. And this slide right here really gets to the heart of the tragedy. They imagined this supernatural monster feeding on their family from the grave, when the real killer was a microscopic one, passing invisibly through the air in their own home. And here's the most tragic irony of it all. It's the timing. A full decade before Mercy's exhumation, a scientist named Robert Koch had already discovered the bacterium that causes tuberculosis. The science was out there, but that knowledge hadn't yet reached isolated communities like Exeter. They were acting out of fear, completely unaware that the scientific answer already existed. Her story, however, lives on. Known as the last of the New England vampires, Mercy's grave has become a popular tourist spot. Visitors often leave small gifts, things like jewelry or even plastic vampire teeth, a strange modern tribute to her tragic tale. A note once left at her grave simply read, "Go, girl." And that kind of captures the strange evolution of her legacy. The story of Mercy Brown, a victim of disease and superstition, has been reframed over time, turning her into a kind of folk hero and a permanent, fascinating part of American folklore. And it leaves us with a final thought. It's really easy to look back and judge the frightened villagers of 1892, but when we're confronted with things we don't understand, things that scare us, how different are we, really?